My name is Clay Morey. I'm the president of the International Astronautical Federation. Thank you for joining us here in the beautiful city of Baku. When I was elected president of the IAF in Dubai, immediately they said to me, what's your mandate? What's your agenda for the next 3 years of your term? And I sat for a moment and reflected, and then thought about all the topics and issues I had heard during the many sessions that I was involved with, either attending or actively moderating or participating in Dubai at the IC. And really the topics were quite clear and obvious to me, in fact. And this is really where I came up with this idea of SIS, sustainability, investment, and security, as themes, 3 themes, which are all, by the way, interconnected, that we should be really focusing on over the next few years. And just to briefly explain, and then we'll get into this discussion, when you talk about sustainability, it has two facets to it. One is sustainability in space, which ties, by the way, back to security very nicely. But sustainability in space is a big issue. Today, the largest actor in space is SpaceX by far, in terms of number of satellites, in terms of number of launches. This is a commercial entity. And you're going to see Kuiper coming. I think the second largest is probably OneWeb satellites. You have companies now operating hundreds, if not thousands, of satellites in orbit. Used to be the capability of a nation state, a strategic asset and capability. Used to be the old answer to that was going to be either the Department of Defense or NASA or somebody else. Now it's commercial operators that have really become the world's largest actors in space. And then sustainability for life here on Earth. And so this sustainability here on Earth is really key. It was said earlier this week at the UN workshop that there's 54 data elements that the United Nations looks at to figure out climate change and climate action mitigation. And 26 of those are related directly and only to space capabilities for to be able to look at those. So we wouldn't understand climate change without space. Investment, there's a huge multi-billion dollars of investment in space that's taken place over the last several years, both governments through funds that they fund and then private sector, private equity investment and individuals investment like people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. So that's a huge driver for what we're seeing in this commercial space revolution, and we want to make sure that these investors and players understand the time horizons, understand the technologies, capabilities. And by the way, unless you have a safe, sustainable, and secure environment in space, you're not going to invest in space, right? So again, they're all tied together. Security, when I say security, it's the small s of security. It's not about militarization in space. This is about having secure space in a way. So when you think about this, and there's no common, I would say no common language around this, but it's evolving. When we talk about secure space, we talk about all these actors operating in this heavens above us and the commons above us in a way where we can have best practices, we can have rules and norms and practices that try to get us to a place where we can all operate safely and securely. That goes from radio spectrum to collision avoidance to space traffic management to a whole number of things that will create a long-term ability for people to operate safely in space. So that's the short version, hopefully, of why and how SIS starts. I have 3 fantastic panelists with me today. I appreciate you guys joining me on stage today. And so, Ru, let's start with you. So, Ru is an ambassador at the Milo Space Science Institute, which is part of the Arizona State University. And she's written and done a lot of work in the law and policy and regulation side of this. And I'm just going to give it to you for a few minutes to talk about your views on SIS.
Thank you very much, Clay. I'll start with a very cheesy pun and say that space does not operate, unfortunately, in a legal vacuum. And I think some of the discussions we have on sustainability always leave out the important element of the role that law and policy plays in fostering certainty and also sustainability. I work for the Milo Space Science Institute, which is creating access to space, and it hinges on three important pillars that I'll touch on and link to the policy regulations. Firstly, there is workforce development that we need to look into in training, especially the next generation of scientists, legal scholars, people that can transfer the knowledge and technology to future generations. And I must commend you, Clay, for the initiative that you've taken in ensuring that the next generation has a voice. About 40% of the participants here are next gen under the age of 35. And this is really critical to ensuring that the technologies and the benefits that we create today can be experienced by the next generation. So thank you very much for that. On the business of space, we look at investment policy in a way that not only ensures certainty and confidence, but also ensures that there's a return of investment. And what we need here is an adaptive governance approach that recognizes that technology and new business models are expanding, perhaps faster than the multilateral processes that we have at play. And this is where perhaps soft law dominance can have an intervening role in allowing us to create uniformity amongst standards. And I believe Richard is here. We had a very interesting US-Africa meeting where you said something that really spoke to me, and we need to manage expectations and have continuous dialogue on what are the expectations of the end users and what are the expectations of the commercial entities themselves in ensuring that they remain viable and they have the legitimate political and commercial will to continue their operations. We also have very difficult conversations around the trade and investment related aspects, including, for instance, export policy, and ensuring that we allow this interoperability between not only hardwares and softwares, but also perhaps skilled personnel amongst jurisdictions. There needs to be an openness, especially if we continue to use space as a tool to unite different regions. We need to be able to unite on different common principles of international participation and cooperation. So I hope that these are all discussions that we will continue to foster even going forward. And lastly, on the matter of exploration, I come from Africa, of course, and we frequently are looking for opportunities to include our voice, our stance as emerging nations. And again, this is a core element of sustainability, ensuring that not only next gen, but as diverse actors have an opportunity to share their expectations of outer space as well. I would like to think that Africa is the emerging nation to look out for in the future, and we have a rich cultural heritage that needs to be transcribed into international policy. Looking at, for instance, a case study on mining governance, I see a rich opportunity for Africa to speak into in situ resource utilization as an example of what multi-stakeholder participation and involvement can result in if we have a clear economic strategy for managing all these different interests in resource development. So to that end, I will conclude by saying space sustainability policy is still growing. It's a very creative exercise, but I certainly hope that with continued discussions along these lines, we can look towards a common future, one that is grounded in international treaty law and that also makes provision for different countries to speak in with their national sovereignty at hand to bring about a good expected end. Thank you.
Thank you, Ru. Marielle. Marielle Borowitz, by the way, is Associate Professor at the School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. Thank you for joining us. She's written extensively on space traffic management, Earth observation, cislunar. So please, Marielle, give us your thoughts.
Thank you, Clay. Oops. There we go. Thank you, Clay. Got it. So I'm so happy to be here today and really interested to talk about this topic of sustainability, investment, and security. To me, as Clay mentioned, I do research on space traffic management, I look at Earth observation issues, and I do cislunar. And I really see this kind of SIS topic across all three of those areas. So when I think about issues of space traffic management, for example, this goes right to the heart of sustainability of our activities in space, right? That the technology that we have, very exciting, but in some ways it's moving faster than our policy has moved and then our ability to coordinate as an international community has moved. So that we're in a situation now where we're doing a pretty good job of monitoring what's in space and trying to predict when there might be conjunctions. But when there is a potential collision, we still have a pretty ad hoc system in terms of, you got to try and find the contact information for the other person, try and pick up the phone, hope they pick up the phone, and then try to coordinate a maneuver. It's a pretty difficult system that's probably not going to scale well at the pace that we're going. So I see a lot of need for work on the sustainability of the system there. And I think part of the solution, at least, is investment, both from governments, who I think are really increasing their SSA capabilities right now, their ability to track and monitor, and also from the private sector that I think is building and bringing new and innovative solutions to this space. And then, of course, it closely ties into security. Like many other areas, you can't really separate watching the skies for safety and sustainability purposes without recognizing that there are also security concerns in space. And so I think really close coordination among these different communities is going to be really important as we move forward. On the Earth observation side, again, Earth observation, as Clay mentioned, is foundational to our ability to understand climate change, as well as a wide variety of other environmental issues. So it plays into security or into sustainability in that way. I think our move towards open access policies to a lot of Earth observation data is hugely important for solving those problems. I think the investment, again, of the commercial sector, commercial remote sensing, playing a really interesting role in what's possible. I think we have to be creative about how governments and commercial entities work together in that field. And then, of course, again, security closely tied in, particularly with that commercial development. We're the biggest customer that we see for a lot of these commercial remote sensing companies are defense industry actors and national security actors. So being thoughtful about how those relationships are formed and how that kind of changes the transparency of the security environment. And then lastly, in cislunar, again, I think it crosses all these areas. So we've had the idea of returning to the moon for decades. You can go back and see speeches of people wanting to bring back that capability. And it's really only just the last few years that we seem to have gotten a sustainable path. Where it really looks like we have the momentum now as a global community to go. And I think it's because it cuts across these three areas. Because we have that civil interest that we always have, it's inspirational, but now we have commercial interest as well, right? And commercial actors that are able to contribute to this goal. And then we have some security interest and the ability to pull across all of these governments, to have this competitive element and cooperative element. I think it's really creating a lot of new opportunities.
Super, thank you. Mariel mentioned private sector involvement, which is perfect lead-in for our third speaker today, Nobu Okada, who is the CEO and founder of Astroscale, a company really dedicated to on-orbit servicing and having a secure and safe and sustainable ecosystem in orbit. And I think Nobu can talk exactly to this point. And thank you for joining us, Nobu, and appreciate you being on the panel.
Thank you for having me here. I'm Nobu. I'm a big fan of security and sustainability, but let me focus on investment side because I'm taking lead in the investment committee here at IAF. What is the ideal situation of the investment for space community? So we want private sector funding and public funding, and then newcomers create new technologies, innovations, bringing in healthy competition, and price goes down and more application comes, and investors get return, and more private money, public money comes in. We want to have this good cycle. But what is the worst scenario is even investment money in a company does not materialize the business case, and the private funding dries up, and private sector say goodbye to the space industry, and only the price keeps high in space, and only limited countries and billionaires keep playing the game in space. this is a vicious cycle. And which cycle we are heading to? There are 3 good news and 2 bad news. Which you want to hear first?
Good news.
Good news. Okay, good. Let me get started with good news.
I'm an optimist. I got to go with the good news first.
So good news. The first, actually the conflict between Russia and Ukraine highlighted the importance of the space infrastructure, and government spending is increasing for space. That's 1. 2, private sector engagement is necessary in all the countries right now. So far, government took lead in space development, but now government are kind of sparing some effort to the private sectors. The third good news is that AI and new technologies on the ground are actually expanding massively the application of space data. So increasing the market right now. So these are 3 good news for investment. The 2 bad news is 1, space is getting more and more congested. And, as you said, exponentially congested. So, and the chain reaction of the collision can happen at any near future. And so risk is increasing, return is decreasing, because every hour satellites are doing maneuvering, every hour right now. So that's increasing the risk, reducing the return. Second bad news is, I forgot. Maybe only 1.
So way more good news than bad news. So that's good. That's a place I want to be. Yeah. No, I'm sure there's more bad news.
But anyway, yeah, they're the main ones. Anyway, so okay, let me turn over to.
Yeah, no, sure. And if it comes to you, just break the bad news, but do it gently, please. Okay. Marielle, you talked a little bit about space traffic management, right? So space traffic management has a lot of facets to it. I can remember when I worked in the launch industry back in the day, and we were trying to launch a very precious payload for Europe on an Ariane 5 rocket. And it was just after this Chinese ASAT test had occurred. And we were concerned of hitting something on the way up into space, right, on the way up. And so we reached out to, at the time it was called JSPOC in California, in Vandenberg Air Force Base, for help and guidance. And they produced these 2-line elements that are there from a base of ground-based radars around the world. But we found the information was maybe not as high fidelity as we would have liked. It was hard to make a real rational decision, right, in terms of it. At the end of the day, we launched, everything was fine, just so the outcome was good. But it really taught me that we need better capabilities in terms of monitoring what's happening in space. I think there's going to be massive computing power needed to understand that, given that the upper parts of the atmosphere are expanding, given to activity of the sun with solar flares and things. So this it's a very dynamic environment that's difficult to model, difficult to predict. So how does the private sector play in this? This seems like one of these key areas where it's the providence of governments. But is there a role the private sector can play in figuring out what's up there and how we do space traffic management? I know the Commerce Department in the United States is now saddled with this. So I don't know, give us a little insight into how this will work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question. So definitely space situational awareness has room to improve. Yeah. We're tracking objects in space. We're trying to predict these conjunctions. But we know that it's not perfect data. We don't know exactly where things are. The conjunctions that get produced by the United States might not always agree with the conjunctions produced by other independent systems in the world, right? Which is problematic if you're kind of getting different guidance from different entities. So absolutely, I think there's a lot that we need to do there. And I think the commercial sector does have some capabilities that they can bring. So I think there were some very smart entrepreneurs probably around that same time who realized that there were these gaps as well and started building observation systems, telescopes, now radars. There's companies talking about putting objects in space to really increase. So it's not just these national security sensors that were used historically, but really building on that. And that is US companies doing that, but there's companies all around the world that have started this. So as you get more observations and more different types of observations, and those observations are being collected in different parts of the world, you really can improve SSA pretty significantly. And so I think that ability that now the Commerce Department and nations all over the world will have to just purchase that data, right? Rather than having to start from scratch and build up all their own sensors, they can purchase this data and sometimes even just the services and kind of leapfrog that process. So I don't think we have it all figured out yet, but I think there's a lot of contribution the commercial sector can make.
Nobu Ru, no? Ru, what happens if two private sector satellites collide, or if it's a government and a private sector satellite that collide? What happens? Who's at fault? Who's at risk? What happens from a legal policy perspective?
That is a very important question, a legal gap that we have right now in alternative dispute resolution and liability. I'll start first with, of course, the prevailing treaty frameworks. We have the 5 main space treaties, and one of which includes the Liability Convention, which has a fault-based provision of liability. Basically, what needs to happen is there needs to be a space object, it needs to happen in outer space, and there needs to be fault. And determining that fault is often quite tricky. There needs to be some form of metric to determine the extent to which an actor has acted either intentionally or negligently. And this is actually a provision that is yet to be employed in outer space. So we have an entire treaty framework that has failed to find application simply because we have the dichotomy of state versus commercial participation. And what happens then if we have a dispute between a state and a commercial entity? Well, then we may have to rely on existing frameworks, such as the Investor-State Dispute Resolution Framework, which is currently our closest analogous framework to apply in such conditions. And we rely then to mandatory referral powers, either through arbitration and mediation in the interest of expediency. Arbitration, of course, has a binding and enforceable resolution, which, of course, commercial entities usually go for because they're looking for something that can be applied across jurisdictions. If you have companies like Starlink that are operating across different countries, you need the certainty that a court order will be applied uniformly and in a way that continues business operations. But I'd also like to propose that mediation can be an important alternative as well, because we need to continue business in a way that fosters, I would say, relationships. And mediation, though non-binding and perhaps some may say non-enforceable, it allows for a negotiation that has common interest at the root of it all. This, of course, goes down to how many countries have been able to ratify the existing conventions. So, for instance, if it's arbitration, there's the New York Convention, which is very widely adopted. The Singapore Convention on Mediation, not so much. But what we need at this point is government advisory and capacity building interventions to ensure that a dispute resolution framework is advanced that allows for the coming together of parties in the interests of space and preserving the relationships at the same time. So looking forward to building on that capacity, but it is a living document, a living discussion.
Great. Nobu?
Just quick, I fully agree with you, and I just want to add urgency. So in 2026 and 2027, the space environment will be far more congested because the first generations of the couple of the constellation will start deorbiting, and they will launch new generations, which is larger than existing ones. So the space traffic management will be quite messy. So more precise SSA data, everybody's maneuvering. So we need kind of semi-real-time based data. FMLS is needed to avoid unfortunate event.
Go ahead, Mari.
Something too. Yeah, I was just going to say that. No, but that's such a good point. And one of the challenges that we have more than we had in the past is this issue of maneuvering, right? That everyone needs to maneuver. There's a lot of really exciting new capabilities that require maneuvering in space. But so there's also a role for the private sector as private operators in space to share some of that information, right? And find a way to share your maneuvering plans and the ways that we're operating in space. That, again, is going to be a really important important part of keeping space safe and sustainable. So it's another, kind of different way of thinking about the role of the commercial
There are
sector.
some associations and groups, right, that are promoting commercial, sharing data for the commercial industry, yeah? Okay. So, Nobu, one of the questions that Marielle had sent me earlier before the panel was how national security agencies could actually leverage commercial capabilities, companies like yours and others. And I always get asked the question, who's going to pay for this stuff? How do we, if whether it's taking a satellite, putting it up into a graveyard orbit, taking a satellite down, or cleaning up the space environment, who pays? How does it work? And how do governments take advantage of the commercial capabilities that you're offering?
Thank you for the question. By the way, before answering the question, I don't recall the second bad news. Sorry about that.
Here it comes.
Those space companies who became public over the last couple of years have not reached the business projection. So this is actually discouraging the analysts and buy-side investors. They are staying away from space investment. This is pretty bad. So the actions for two bad news is one is have a proper system, SSS system, and proper governance and to secure the sustainability. Second one, don't go public too early. So this is quite important. We need someone. I know some companies are keeping private funding to the extent they can until they have a stable revenue growth. So that's one. So answering a question, who pays money for the on-orbit servicing? And then, so 10 years ago when I started my company, not many people supported our mission. People told me, hey, Nobu, who pays money for you for debris removal? But today is different. So we are talking with constellations right now, and we have a kind of a joint mission with OneWeb, to remove their defunct satellite in space, because the constellations put multiple satellites in one orbit plane, and they have a multiple orbital plane. If they leave defunct, certain percentage of their satellites go defunct in space statistically, and if they leave the satellites there, they might hit their own satellites and then contaminate their orbital plane. So to keep their business, they need to maintain the cleanness of the orbit. So Constellation is one of the customers, and regarding the large object in space, which is up there already, it should be cleared up by the government for global benefit. And then polluters pay for the cost. But good news is now multiple space agencies are taking lead and then taking actions, and then there's a project in the world right now. So, and then regulation will come soon. So FCC introduced a 5-year rule, which will become effective from 2024. And then, as you know, the FCC first fined for company, about the kind of leaving a trace in space. So I think regulatory environment is also evolving. I hope this will continue and create a market more.
So, the Communications Act in the United States that authorized the federal communications of 1934 couldn't have contemplated space, right? So, Ru, how is it that they have? What's the authority or the hook? How do they get satellite operators and others to actually, function properly, to have norms and good behavior in deorbit, and have enough fuel to deorbit the satellite? How does that work from a regulatory standpoint?
What we're seeing now, because of the way that new business models are emerging quicker than perhaps the multilateral process can handle, is we have what's called the development of industry-led norms, which is the industry taking a role now in determining what are their best practices, and through consistent practice, this becomes customary international law, which is widely recognized and practiced among states. I'll start by just discussing sort of the hierarchical or multi-stakeholder nature of the industry. We have, of course, states being the primary actors in outer space, and this is articulated in Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, which provides that states need to be able to create regulations that speak to the interests of different stakeholders. These interests are non-governmental entities, and also, and sometimes overlooked, are the community as well, from where we derive our political will. They legitimate our actions in space, and that's where we derive also inspiration to continue to bring different end user needs. So ultimately, states are responsible for bringing that certainty in the different ecosystem and innovation development. But what we see now is states are beginning to have a backlog in terms of advancing policies, especially for these, what I call force multipliers that are being advanced, especially in national security, commercial capabilities, for instance, artificial intelligence, blockchain, virtual reality, and affiliated markets like cybersecurity and drones. There needs to be a policy for each and every single one of these subsectors. And what we see is when there's a gap in that, we have situations where business is hampered. We've seen some responsive applications from, for instance, I believe the FCC removed some regulations from commercial remote sensing that has liberalized the market in ways that have allowed for more innovation. Umbra is a good case study of this. They've just released $1 million worth of free open access data, which is so important for ecosystem building. So to that end, I sincerely believe that we need a situation where there's that continuous dialogue that provides for not only the top-down governance approach, but also bottom-up, because we are seeing that industry does understand more closely the situations they are facing in terms of transfer of data, of coordination, and states certainly need to have them at the legal negotiation table.
Thank you. We got about 14 minutes left. If you guys have questions, I got a couple on Slido here that I'm going to get to in just a second. But before I do, I want to talk about the moon. This is a huge topic here at this conference, and obviously for the Artemis program, and going back to the moon is a huge priority for a number of the space agencies. When I was on the heads of agency session on Monday, everyone talked about going back to the moon, about the Artemis Accords and going up there. There's also commercial rovers that are set to go to the moon. How is this going to work in terms of sustainability on the lunar surface? And I'll start with you, Marielle, but maybe there's other things. Nobu, I don't know if you're thinking about servicing around the moon or all, but and then Ru on the policy side. But let's start, Marielle. You want to talk a little bit about it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that's really key, why we have so much momentum and why I think we will succeed as a global community in returning to the moon is because we have so many actors involved this time. And that means lots of different countries, right? This is not just two nations racing to the moon, right? This is a whole community of nations that are involved in this activity, and not just the states, right? Also commercial actors. I think we're still in the process of figuring out, where are we cooperating? Where do we have some hopefully healthy competition? And even with the role of the commercial sector, I think certainly we see already in the US, trying to leverage the commercial sector, which I think can be really valuable. And there are entrepreneurs who hope that they can make money on the moon, even separate from government investment. So I think my personal guess is that's a little bit further away, but these are the steps that you need to take first, right? Develop those technologies, get that government investment, make it to the moon to start down that path of actually being able to make money and have a more sustainable sector.
No? You care to talk about the moon, or is that not your providence?
Of course, cislunar is also our business area too. But a high-level comment from me is, if we want to use other planet and will live in other planet, the governance should be better than on the Earth, not worse than on the Earth. So we need a kind of rule. But the good news is, there's always good news, is Artemis Accord and already has that kind of ambition within that. Many countries already signed and how to sustainably use the moon. So that's a good point.
Ru, moon?
Going back to the moon and doing it sustainably really requires that governance approach that speaks again to the responsive and responsible innovation. This is where soft law dominance, like the Artemis Accords, can sort of play that harmonization role in allowing us to implement in a way that is coordinated, but also speaks to the heart of the prevailing treaty frameworks. One of the very core topics of going back to the moon is space resource utilization, which actually, according to the Outer Space Treaty, is permissible. Legal scholars agree that we can use resources insofar as we are exercising our right to freedom of use and exploration, and of course, for in-situ development that is necessary for the advancement of exploration. But to the point of can we commercialize space resources, this is where we have some contention, and again requires us to have a multiple prong approach in creating dialogue and coming to consensus on how commercial companies must operate in outer space. We see a dichotomy in the ratification of the different treaties. Of course, the Outer Space Treaty is widely ratified and is quite permissive in space resource utilization. And then we have the Moon Agreement, which proposes more of a common approach. That is to say that states should work together and states should avoid having a unilateral approach to outer space. And for that reason, we see there's been not as wide ratification, and actually Saudi Arabia pulled out at some point, which to my eye would signify there is a questioning of whether the international treaty frameworks are supportive enough of these new kinds of business models. The Artemis Accords, of course, provide for some detail on space resources, acknowledging that it is important for innovation and will lead us to the gateway to beyond. So to this end, I would still advance again that it's an adaptive governance approach that we need to take for the moon. We need to look at the property rights regime and can you own the moon? I would like to say that it is very important to acknowledge that space resources are a kind of property that can be owned, that can be transferred. We're seeing this coming up in different case studies of donations or nominal contracts for the return of lunar regolith. What do we do then where there is a contract of sale or where there is a passing on of these materials or the sharing of data and knowledge around that? What can we apply from the existing frameworks? These are all questions that are coming up at the moment. And I would say lastly and finally, we need that research and development basis to allow us to continue to create consensus and transparency and confidence building measures around that.
Okay, we have 8.5 minutes to go. I'm going to go into Slido lightning round. Okay, so hold on. It's going to get very fast paced. All right, starting with, somebody asked me here, do you see the IAF doing investment forums? We're not trying to recreate investment forums. There's plenty of investment forums around the world. What we would like to do, and Carissa Christensen is chairing the task force that's looking at the investment sector, and Nobu is overseeing this activity and involved. What we want to do is attract more investors to come to the IEC and our global events. We want to educate them about the opportunities, the long time horizons, the technologies, the regulatory policies at work in space. So they're investing wisely in space. Nobu mentioned about a number of companies that pumped to very high valuations and then disappointing returns, and then they fell back to earth, bad pun. They came back down to earth very quickly. So we want to educate investors. I do see us doing side events with the investor community. I do see us doing events where we can put together entrepreneurs, startup companies, and investors in sessions. But we're not going to start our own series of investment conferences. I think there's plenty of those out there, and happy to. Nobu, any?
So thanks for the leadership of the Clay. We already started SIS activities, and this at the Baku, we do had a multiple investment kind of discussion, and then we had a panel on Tuesday. So kind of the room was occupied fully, and so I understand how much investment topic is your agenda. So this year, we already had a kind of a multiple investors here, but maybe next year, following year, we want to invite more kind of prestigious investors to the venue.
Super. All right, Marielle, there's a question here about all of this is not possible without some kind of mechanism or worldwide collaboration. So in the air traffic management, we have ICAO, right? And the FAA in the US, but there's regulatory bodies when we have ICAO, this international body. Do we need ICAO for space? How does that work?
So I think we need something better than we have today. There's a lot of discussion right now about what that's going to look like. How do we actually do that coordination? I think one of the ideas that I've heard talked about a lot is the concept of a federated system, where there's going to be, the US has its system that it operates now, SpaceTrack, shifting over to TRAX, the kind of civil version of that. EUSST is providing these kind of SSA services. But there's going to be multiple centers around the world. And if those centers can really effectively talk to each other, then perhaps we can coordinate, make sure we're giving consistent guidance to satellite operators, for example. So I think, you might have a federated system like that. You're still going to have some of these conversations in some kind of forum. And I don't know, honestly, yet which forum is going to be the right one to have those discussions, and whether at some point we go beyond just best practices into something that's a more active management.
Maybe
something like
self-interest
ICAO.
is not enough. We're going to need something stronger than that.
So the example I give is, as we, in every other domain, we see rules about how you operate, right? And how you coordinate with others. And I think that can be a good thing for providing the sustainability, for the, decreasing risk for people in those areas. So the example I say is when I'm driving my kids to school in the morning and I get to a stoplight, I don't want to hope that the other driver follows the best practice of stopping at red lights. I want to really be sure they're going to stop. So someday we might get to that stage. I think that's not happening tomorrow. But at some point, we might get there in space, that it's a regime just like in other places where we need to have actual agreements about how we interact with each other.
Okay, Ru, I got a question here about Africa. So basically you have a continent that's rich in natural resources, but also vulnerable on the issue of sustainability. How is Africa participating in this discussion? And thank you, by the way, for coming and for being here. And I know we had the Africa, I can't now forget the name. Say it again, please.
The U.S.-Africa Commercial Space Stakeholders Meeting.
Yeah, so this was fantastic. It was organized by the U.S. Department of Commerce and a number of entities, and the IAF was happy to work with Aja Cosmos. And we want to do more of that, by the way. I think it was really key to try to get nations and actors from the continent to come. I'd love to see more of that in the future. So, but to address the question, how do we, what's the inputs that's coming from Africa? How is Africa playing on the policy side? What's your take on that?
Thank you very much. Africa has a common policy framework under the African Union Commission known as the African Space Policy and Strategy, which speaks to advancing space mainly for SDG purposes. That is our common agenda. 55 member states are conglomerated under the African Outer Space Program, and actually in this year we've seen the establishment of the African Space Agency, which will be headquartered in Egypt. Our industry is predominantly downstream, dominated about 60% by Earth observation applications. And then we see some capabilities developing in the upstream as well, and it's important we hone these capabilities to reposition the narrative of Africa not only as consumers, but also producers and providers of key technologies. We're seeing also an uptick in entrepreneurship. There are about 318 new space companies across Africa, and we have different hubs around the continent, including South Africa, Egypt, of course, Morocco, Tunisia, and about 20 space agencies that have collectively launched 58 satellites into outer space. It is a nascent industry, but it's showing rapid acceleration in the interests of uniting the continent and providing a more strong voice in international dialogue. What Africa needs is mutual reciprocity, agreements that speak to our desire to grow and learn, and as well to share our resources and abundance in a way that is sustainable not only for us, but also for international relations. I'll give a very abstract example, but benefits sharing is something that is not frequently discussed openly enough. And take, for example, some of the critical elements or resources that go into space system development. If we're to derive lithium from a resource-rich country, who's to say that the benefit that will ultimately come from the satellite will still filter back to the community where that same mineral came from? And these are the discussions we need to be having. Corporate social responsibility is an overlooked principle in international negotiations, and that's what we need commerce to drive now, to ensure that that tangible benefit reaches even the most remote of communities, especially the communities from where that critical origin process begins.
Fantastic. Okay, 1 minute. Last question, Nobu. Here we go. How is public acquisition of security applications and capabilities from private sector space actors different from other security domains where there's common practice that where this is normal for them to just buy these capabilities and services?
Can you repeat the question again?
So basically, they want. I think that who's ever asking the question wants to know when national security agencies go to buy capabilities and services from a company like yours. How is it different than maybe other places where this is very quite normal in cyber and other places where they're buying capabilities, services, technology? How is it different in space, or is it different in space? Let me put it that way.
Yeah, so I think I can answer in different level, but very quickly. So all the space technologies are dual use. So rocket can be missile, Earth observation satellite can be spy satellite, and then on-orbit servicing capability can be used for malicious reasons. But the key point is transparency and confidence building, and then to avoid any kind of concerns and then negative understanding. So that we're taking care of. And even when we are servicing to the defense side, we always have an importance of the transparency.
Super duper. That puts us at 0 on the clock. Boom, we came in right on time. All right, thank you guys all for joining us today. Thank you to my panelists. This was fantastic conversation. I hope the conversation continues and we get even more involved in this subject, in these subject areas over the next few years. Thanks.